Hey guys, welcome to yet another episode of Parvez's Trade. My name is Parvez Khan, and I'll be talking about global economics. And if you guys haven't watched yet, in my previous episode, we talked about Japan's economy. And in this episode, I want to get into Australia, Australia's economy, its history, what the current economy looks like in Australia, what the future holds for Australia. And yeah, let's get to it. So, first of all, for those of you who don't know, Australia is basically a colonial leftover, as I like to call it, of the British Empire. And it was basically a penal colony where prisoners from the British Empire were sent. And after Australia gained independence, it was mostly in the beginning an uh, agrarian society. So you're basically a society that's producing just raw material commodities like sheep wool, wheat, grains, and other raw products. And it hasn't, in my opinion, I mean, the service sector grew in Australia, obviously. So when Australia first started, it was mostly, and its economy was dominated by these raw agricultural products. And now it has changed a bit ever since then. The service sector right now makes up 70% of Australia's economy. So that just tells you how much it has changed, and 71% to be exact. But yeah, Australia's main other economy is basically its raw materials that it exports, iron ore and wine, beef, and also it has a bit of manufacturing base. But Australia's current economy is basically dominated by the service sector. So it's basically heavily dependent on consumer uh, confidence, the spending power of the consumers. And so it's very sensitive to interest rates by the Central Bank of Australia. And if you haven't read any recent news from Australia, Australia's households have a record level of debt, just like most Western economies. Their debt levels of their households are at a record level. And yes, COVID just accelerated the process, and they're paying more and more interest on those debts because the interest rates are high. And so obviously the service sector has taken a hit as a result of that. And of course, Australia has decided to cut down on immigration. That's going to take a hit on the service sector as well. And so, what does the future look like for Australia? Well, obviously, when you talk about any country in the world right now, you have to talk about USA and China because they're basically competing for influence in any country around the world. And people said that Australia is basically an ally of the West or ally of USA. I disagree because Australia has a very big and growing Asian population to begin with. Australia's Darwin port, the seaport in Darwin, is owned by a Chinese company with a 99-year lease. Yeah. So and Australia's major export market is China by far. So can Australia really side with USA in a war of USA versus China and just basically destroy their export markets and push the country into a recession? I don't think it will go well with the Australian people. The Aussies will not like that. And yeah, so then we come into what does the future look like for Australia? I mean, yes, we talked about the growing household debt. We talked about them having a very unequal economy. The wealth gap is increasing as the household debts are increasing. And so, I talked about this in previous episodes. When your middle class household debts are very high and the interest rates are high from the central bank, the middle class has a shrinking amount of non-discretionary spending power. And that you basically destroy the middle class in the process. And then you basically push the economy, you incentivize the economy to produce goods for the rich because there's not a big middle class with a big purchasing power to sell to. And that's basically in what's been happening in Australia recently. Can they reverse the tide? I don't think so because, well, there's going to be a war in Asia. I've been talking about this, and it will be important for Australia to make a strategic decision to sit out. I mean, if they side with USA and then they're basically wrecking their export markets in China and other Asian countries, and but if they don't side with USA, USA will basically remove its military protection from Australia. Will Australia be okay with that? And yeah, so it really comes down to your economy and your military. So Australia has to decide what's more important, getting the military security from USA or the economic security from by trading with Asia, a growing middle class in Asia, mainly China. And it's obvious for most people around the world that USA is on its decline. So I'm sure Aussies are also looking at that fact. You don't want to side with a potential future loser because that will not end well for you when you lose the war. And so yeah, Australia has recently this they had a conservative government, but then recently they elected a more liberal government. And yeah, so what does the future look like? I mean, yeah, they're part of the AUKUS deal, right, with USA and UK. They're building nuclear submarines under that deal. Not sure if Trump will continue with the deal. He might. I mean, USA is making money from the deal, so he might continue with it. But Australia will have to decide whether it wants to sacrifice its economy for safety, basically. And even then, you have to ask yourself, is China really a big security threat to Australia? And yeah, do you really want to sacrifice all your economic benefits of export to Asia by sacrificing a potential threat from China? Or not even a likely threat, not even a guaranteed threat, a potential threat. And I think this is where it'll come down to the leadership of Australia, what they want. I believe in any Australia. So, like, let's not, beat around the bush. Most of Australian population is still of European descent. Obviously, they'll trust the Europeans and European descendants in US more than they'll trust Chinese people. Some may call it racist, but I just think, human beings have a natural tendency to trust people that look similar to them, that talk and behave similar to them. That's just how it works. But will that really be the best move on the chessboard for Australia? I don't think so. So my prediction is Australia's service sector will continue to shrink as the household debt grows. The middle class has less spending power. I mean, the housing market in Australia is wrecked. People say Australia is such a big country. Why is the housing market so expensive in Australia? But you have to understand that most of Australia is not currently inhabitable. So most of the people live in the coastline. The inland Australia is basically empty, and the reason being it gets extremely hot, extremely dry in the summer. This and it's inland Australia is made up of these natural habitats that are reserved and for the animals. So that's one of the reasons why Australia has such a tight housing market. And yeah, so if Australia decides that it wants to sacrifice its economy, I mean, the service sector is going to shrink because the middle class is getting wrecked with all this household debts. So that's not going to change anytime soon. And then you talk about the manufacturing base. It's Australia does not, it has cheap energy to some extent, but it's not as competitive as the other manufacturing bases like in China and Asia. So the manufacturing base is not likely to be able to compete on a global level, especially with USA coming into the manufacturing sector now with under Trump. And then you have this exporting of raw materials to Asia, and they're basically sacrificing that to please the USA to make sure USA gives them the military security. So do you really want to make bets on like what are the upsides, right? I don't see any upside in the service sector anytime soon. And I don't see any upside in the manufacturing base. Simply, they might have cheap energy, but we'll talk about that in another video. They have a very liberalized power market, which is full of greedy power traders, and they're jacking up the prices to make money. And so I don't know. I don't think that energy market is as cheap as it can be, but I don't think their manufacturing base can grow significantly to compete with Asia's manufacturing base. And then you have the exporting of raw materials, and that too will be hampered if Australia decides to side with USA in the fight against China. And so, what would I do if I was betting on Australia? Well, when your middle class is getting wrecked like that and piling up more and more household debt, and the living standards of Aussies is now declining at the fastest pace in the history of Australia. There was a recent report that came out that Australia's middle class living standards are getting destroyed and declining at the fastest pace than ever seen in recent history. You'll be left with a dissatisfied middle class, which will basically just switch between the liberals and the conservatives, but none of them will be actually be able to solve the structural problem, which is they cannot give up US's military protection because all the equipments and all the military is aligned with the Western militaries. So they have to give up on exporting raw materials to Asia, China. They cannot improve the service sector any further because they're cutting back on immigration. They're cutting back on the households are cutting back because they have record level of debt. And another that's a structural flaw that you can switch between liberals and conservatives, but the structural flaw will be there. And they cannot improve their manufacturing based competitive edge because they don't have a cheap labor force. They can bring in some AI, but will that be able to compete with cheap labor force, cheap energy source in Asia? I don't think so. Like China and India, they're getting cheap energy from Russia. Australia cannot do that. They have their own energy base, sure, but they have a power sector that's very liberalized in Australia, and you have all these power traders in Australia that are trying to make money from it, so they're trying to jack up the prices artificially, and so the energy cost is not as cheap as people think. So, what? So basically, my prediction is there will be a big revolution from the dissatisfied middle class in Australia, and they'll basically switch back and forth between liberal and conservatives, and then none of them will be able to solve the issue. And then they'll basically go to far right and far left politicians to help them solve the structural issue. But I think unless a strategic, smart leader who can think for his own country, his or her own country, that is Australia, who can get out of this mindset of needing US's military protection from an imaginary threat from China. If they can align with China and get more export into Asia and China, and they can bring in more workforce, and they can get rid of this liberalized power market that's jacking up the energy prices and making the manufacturing base less competitive. And they basically have to find a way to reduce the household debt so that the service sector can pick up and non-discretionary spending can pick up. And the only way they can do that is by monetizing the current debt, which will basically devalue the currency further. And will they be willing to do that? I don't know. So, as things currently stand, you have a declining service sector, manufacturing base that's not going to grow any rapidly anytime soon. The living standards declining at a rapid pace for the middle class. You have the export market shrinking because they can't sell to China. China is putting all these tariffs. And how will this impact the Australian dollar? Well, if your export is shrinking and your middle class household debt has to be monetized in order to get them to spend more money in the service sector, and the manufacturing base is not picking up pace because it's not as competitive as the Asian manufacturing base. I see no way up for the Australian dollar. I see only a decline, a depreciation for the Australian dollar in the short run at least. And the bond market, well, again, it comes back to monetizing the existing debt. So, yeah, I think Australia is a country that had a healthy financial balance sheet. Out of all the G7 countries, Australia actually had a very good, healthy financial balance sheet. But because they got involved in this China-US war, the export market shrank, and that's hampering their financial balance sheet. So I really see nothing good coming out of this. And also, let's talk about something else in Australia that I think is, usually swept under the carpet, which is the natives. So Australia has a strong, big native population, and obviously they don't like this government of Australia. That's part of the Queen's Crown, the King's Crown, UK's. And if they get a chance to revolt and bring this government down that has been established by UK's monarchy, they will take the opportunity, right? That's just obvious, right? And so there's that issue. There's the issue of the natives who are basically hoping for the downfall of this Australian government because they realize that their treaty rights have not been respected. And and there is this colonialist hating native population in Australia that doesn't like the current government. And that'll probably side with China if there's a war in Australia between US and China. And then you have this growing Asian population in Australia that will definitely side with Asia and China. But you have all this few generation old European descent Aussie population, and they're very liberal in their thinking. They're very Western in their thinking, and they'll be basically siding with USA. And before you know it, there's a civil war on the streets. I know it sounds very bleak, but really, these things are very connected, more connected than what people think. And yeah, I just don't see the a good way out of this for Australia. This war between USA and China will impact Australia more closely than what most people think. And China actually has more influence inside Australia's political and economic sphere. They just don't talk about it openly. They just don't want to show it openly. But yeah, if you look at events like China uh, financing political parties, political MPs in Australia, there've been a lot of reports about that recently. So it's been happening, and it will continue to happen. And is there a way out of this? I don't think so. I think the best you can hope for is a smart leader comes to power in Australia and decides to do what is best for their country and not just side with the US on everything blindly. And also, the isolationist policy of Trump will not help Australia, obviously. So there is that. And